Hello, and welcome back to Podfinder. This is Day 5 of the 12 Days of Sinmas, and if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I'll be picking up where I left off with the Runelords of Greed, and today is all about the last and mightiest of Thassilon's great transmuters, Karzoug the Taker, the final and longest reigning Runelord of Greed. And, once I wrap up his story, I'll be making some player and GM suggestions related to the School of Transmutation more broadly. Before that though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Zin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig in. The early life of Karzoug. Karzoug was born in minus 5836 AR during the reign of Runelord Haframa in the city of Malistoke, a large city on the Storval Plateau surrounded by rich ore and stone deposits. Karzoug was, much to his eventual shame, born a slave in the flesh pits of the city. While rumors would swirl in later years that he was secretly a vampire, or the spawn of some powerful dragon, the truth is that Karzoug was nothing more than a human, and a human of the humblest of origins at that. As a slave, he was the property of Malistoke's de facto ruler, the Lich Zinlun. Zinlun was an extremely powerful transmuter, on par with some of Haframa's mightiest apprentices. For reasons unknown, he took interest in the young Karzoug. This interest wasn't benign, however, and Karzoug endured all manner of unspeakable horrors during this time under Zinlun's care. After an agonizing 27 years as a slave, Karzoug managed to negotiate for himself a new master. Zinlun traded Karzoug to another wizard in Malistoke, one who was a known cannibal. Doubtless, the Lich thought his former slave would perish. Karzoug, though, had other plans. Through some unknown act of guile, Karzoug managed to arrange the death of his new master. He plucked the adamantine teeth from the man's skull, then traded them to a wandering demon binder named Thurbal in exchange for an apprenticeship. I should note that some versions of this story claim the teeth were gold, but I'm going with the version from Return of the Runelords which states that they were adamantine. With his new status as an apprentice, Karzoug's life seemed to be on the ups, but that fantasy was short-lived. Thurbal, as one might expect of a demon binder, turned out to be a less-than-ethical person. While Karzoug was technically his apprentice, he saw fit to use the young wizard in training more often as live bait for his fiendish conjurations. And, though Thurbal was an expert in his craft, even he couldn't maintain a perfect record of control. Karzoug was slain more than once during his apprenticeship, and only Thurbal's impressive wealth ensured that he was resurrected to continue his lessons. Though this period in his life lasted only 7 years, Karzoug almost certainly experienced as much trauma here as he had under Zinlun. Still, it wasn't all bad. Karzoug got what he wanted. Thurbal was an accomplished mage and an excellent demon binder, providing Karzoug with a hands-on education in an extremely powerful art. Additionally, several of the demons the conjurer summoned took an interest in Karzoug, and saw fit to instruct the young man in the arts of magic and politics. Even with these benefits, however, Karzoug was always on the lookout for greener pastures, and it was only a matter of time until an opportunity presented itself. That opportunity finally came when, in minus 5802 AR, Runelord Haframa put out a call for new apprentices. This call was open to all, and anyone who could demonstrate sufficient magical knowledge and material wealth would be considered. Seeing his chance, Karzoug took action. During a routine demon binding, Karzoug deliberately scuffed his master's summoning circle, resulting in the summoned fiend being freed. It attacked Thurble and killed him, then promptly returned to the outer rifts. Karzoug wasted no time before looting his former master's possessions, then set out for Xin-Shalast. Presenting himself to Haframa, Karzoug made a strong impression, having learned the finer points of transmutation under Zinlun and having supplemented that knowledge with a practical understanding of demon binding. Karzoug was selected, and at the age of 34 became Runelord Haframa's newest apprentice. Karzoug took well to his new life as Haframa's apprentice. This was the first period in his life when he was not haunted by recurring trauma, and he used his newfound freedom to delve even deeper into his magical studies. His mastery of transmutation, and the teachings of rune magic more broadly, continued to grow. But the topic which captured his interest most strongly was the mysterious denizens of the realm of Leng, and the bizarre magics they could bring to bear. While all the Runelords of Greed and their apprentices had taken an interest in Leng, due to the metaphysical proximity of Xin-Shalast to that mysterious demiplane, Karzoug took that a step further. He began to engage in formal diplomatic relations with the denizens of Leng, and sought to make allies of them so he might exploit their bizarre eldritch knowledge. So, what exactly is Leng? I have to be careful here because a deep discussion of Leng could go on for a half hour or more. At the high level, Leng is a demiplane which exists along the edge of the dimension of dreams, which is itself a plane which exists in parallel to the ethereal plane in the inner sphere. While the dimension of dreams is sustained by and constructed from the dreams of sleeping beings on the material plane, Leng is partially sustained by and constructed from nightmares. This leads many to refer to Leng as the Nightmare Realm. Leng is a finite realm, consisting of a large plateau situated adjacent to a sea which connects to the dimension of dreams. Vast mountain ranges box in the other three sides of the plateau, and a pale moon hangs languidly in the sky. The inhabitants of this strange place range from local variations on ghouls to unique creatures called Leng spiders. At the top of the hierarchy are the unknowable moon beasts, who make demands of the lesser beings on the plane. Most importantly to our story, however, are the denizens of Leng, the humanoid creatures which drape themselves in flowing robes and turbans to hide their alien physiques. These beings, while subservient to the moon beasts, are incredibly powerful in their own right, and have a grasp on magic and metaphysics which is incomprehensible to most mortals. Also, as a side note, Leng is directly taken from the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Many of the writers at Paizo have a deep love of Lovecraftian horror, and most of his work being in the public domain has allowed them to bring some of their favorite elements into the Paizoverse. So, these pleasant creatures, the denizens of Leng, are the ones with whom Karzoug made an alliance. From them, Karzoug learned all manner of eldritch secrets. What he gave them in exchange is unclear, though the denizens of Leng are well known throughout the multiverse as slave traders, so we can probably make an educated guess. Karzoug managed to keep this alliance a secret for years, until finally, in -5759 AR, Haframa realized what was going on. Haframa and his most loyal apprentice, Vej, confronted Karzoug, but they were too late to put a stop to his plans. Karzoug unleashed a terrible spell upon them, one which he had learned from the denizens of Leng. This spell tore their souls from their bodies and hurled them into the multiverse, where they were lost in the spaces between the planes. So it was that in -5759 AR, Karzoug, at the age of 77, ascended to power and took up the Burning Glaive, becoming the 8th Runelord of Greed. Karzoug would go on to rule for 466 years, making him the longest ruling Runelord of Greed. He might have ruled for even longer, had Earthfall not cut his reign short. Karzoug was hailed as the mightiest of the Runelords of Greed, and was considered powerful even among the Runelords of his era. Under his rule, Shalast, and specifically Zin-Shalast, prospered. His capital became the largest and grandest city in all of Thassilon, though this was generally at the expense of the lower castes of his citizenry. Karzoug the Taker, 8th Runelord of Greed. Karzoug himself was a tall, stern, imperious man, with a face locked in either a fierce scowl or a howl of rage. He towered over those around him, and the severity with which he carried himself ensured that even his larger-than-life servitors bowed and seemed to wilt in his presence. In addition to wearing the finest and most powerfully enchanted robes he could create, Karzoug also embedded aeon stones into the flesh of his hands and forehead as a sign of his wealth and power. He was never seen without his burning glaive, but also bore the incredibly dangerous Talons of Leng, a set of gold-inlaid metallic claws, which could warp the minds of their targets when used to attack. Despite all the prosperity and grandeur of his reign, Karzoug's rule was defined in large part by his cruelty. Famously, Karzoug once incinerated an entire city for having come up short in its taxes by only a few silver coins. Of course, no details have been provided on this event by Paizo, so it's entirely possible this event is just a legend or a piece of propaganda from Shalast's own government records. One example of Karzoug's cruelty, which is well detailed, is the destruction of Malistoke. One of the new Runelord's first actions upon seizing power was to erase all records of his own history. Karzoug was deeply ashamed of his origins as a slave, especially for how they compared to the origins of his fellow Runelords, and he sought to eliminate even the barest hints of his past. This manifested most strongly in the complete and total destruction of Malistoke, the city of his birth. This powerful response was also motivated by his smoldering hatred of Zinlun, his former master. I won't be discussing the fate of Zinlun here to avoid drifting into spoiler territory, but Malistoke itself was completely wiped off the map. The city was reduced to rubble, then mined away for the ore beneath its foundations. The land upon which it stood was quarried at a scale heretofore unseen in Shalast. And this takes us nicely into the next defining feature of Karzoug's rule, his monumental construction projects. Karzoug, like many of his fellow Runelords, had a penchant for vanity projects. These were almost universally stonework constructions on a ridiculous scale, many of which depicted the Runelord himself. In Karzoug's case, the first of these was the alteration of the face of Mar Massif, the mountain which towered over Zin-Shalast. Karzoug soon went far beyond this tradition, however. The number and scale of his construction projects dwarfed the efforts of his predecessors, with the possible exception of Gimmel's Spindlehorn. And, much like the Spindlehorn, many of these projects remain in the Age of Lost Omens. The most obvious of these is the Storval Deep itself, the largest lake in all of Varisia. After strip mining the entire region around the ruins of Malistoke, Karzoug decided that the quarried scar on the landscape was far too ugly for his great kingdom. He commissioned the construction of a great dam, the largest ever constructed on Galarian. Rather than decorate it with his own visage, Karzoug decided to instead place the images of skulls upon the dam's face, leading to its name among the modern Varisians, Skull's Crossing. After the dam was complete, including a magic-fueled water-level management system, Karzoug's engineers rerouted the Storval and Kazaran rivers to fill the basin with water. Over many years, these waters slowly rose, forming the Storval Deep. Another vanity project which I want to discuss is the Storval Stairs, a massive stairway leading down from the Storval Plateau to the lower plains of Varisia. These still exist in Varisia today, and are situated just west of the Storval Deep, at a low point in the cliffs separating the Storval Plateau from the Varisian plains beneath. Individual steps on the stairway were taller than the average human, indicating their intended travelers were giants and their kin. On either side of the stairway, a pair of 400-foot statues of Karzoug peered down with imperious scowls. The purpose of these stairs was simple. They allowed for easier travel on the part of Karzoug's armies as they marched from Zin-Shalast to the nation's southern and western borders. Karzoug's armies were made up in large part of giants, from the local forest and stone giants to the towering storm, cloud, and even rune giants who commanded them. Of course, not all of Karzoug's immense construction projects served such mundane purposes. The strange metallic tower called Giltspur is one such example. As his reign continued, Karzoug deepened his relationship with the denizens of Leng. As a sign of this, Karzoug worked with them to develop a permanent portal to their realm. To construct this portal, Karzoug took advantage of a naturally occurring phenomenon called the Dreaming Tower. Generally attributed to Desna and her power over dreams, the Dreaming Tower was a massive structure located in the Dimension of Dreams. A section of the tower, though, somehow phased out of its native dimension and existed, at least partially, in the material plane in Shalast. Karzoug leveraged this artifact's connection to the Dimension of Dreams to open the portal to Leng. Around this portal, he constructed a tower of pale green metal, which he dubbed Giltspur. Giltspur was intended to serve as an embassy to the denizens of Leng on Golarion, a base from which they could research the material plane and work their vile machinations. Karzoug appointed a powerful cleric of Lasala, a woman named Mesmalatu, as his representative at the embassy. In addition to serving as an embassy for the denizens of Leng, Giltspur served as a center of arcane and eldritch research for Karzoug and his apprentices. The structure contained a vast library covering topics related to the inner and outer planes. It also contained laboratory chambers for vile experiments. To give the researchers access to more exotic research subjects, the tower even had a tunneled shaft running hundreds of feet straight down into Sekamina in the Darklands. Karzoug spared no expense in ensuring that the tower was well equipped to protect and encourage highly sensitive research. The whole building was infused with a Mage's Private Sanctum effect, as well as a dimensional lock spell, and all denizens were affected by a passive Tongues effect. While Giltspur was not established until -5353 AR, fairly late in Karzoug's rule, it's worth bringing up here as a representation of just how enmeshed he was with the denizens of Leng. This ties in nicely to another key aspect of Karzoug's reign, his obsession with arcane research. Karzoug directed his apprentices to study an incredibly wide variety of topics, and had research laboratories scattered all throughout his kingdom. Beneath Kaer Maga, for instance, the Runelord maintained several research divisions. One of these was focused on Karzoug's own attempts at flesh warping. Much like his rival Alaznist, Karzoug saw value in the art of flesh warping, and the creation of new monsters to fill out his armies. To aid in this research, Karzoug even managed to reroute a branch of the mystical river Styx to run beneath the city to provide his researchers with a source of mysterious extraplanar energy. His efforts in the field of flesh warping were never tremendously successful, however, especially when compared to his fellow Runelords. Far more successful were his efforts at astronomy. Also under Kaer Maga, Karzoug developed a highly advanced orrery, a model of Golarion's star system. This device was used in Karzoug's experiments with time manipulation, a field which he would eventually advance even further in his work on the Cyphergate. In addition to his orrery, Karzoug successfully contacted several beings on the planet Eox, the undead-ruled sixth planet of Golarion's star system. He cultivated several alliances on Eox, and even managed to bring a few of them to Golarion in the form of simulacra. This all culminated in the creation of a powerful viewing lens, which Karzoug used to observe the sentient societies on other planets near Golarion. Karzoug also maintained research programs within his capital city of Zin-Shalast, and throughout his kingdom, including at the Thoracic Library and at Skull's Crossing. All of this research served a pragmatic purpose, however, as Karzoug had little interest in knowledge for its own sake. The many spells, rituals, and magic items developed under his rule attest to this. The Glove of Strength Stealing, for instance, combined debilitating necromantic magic with enhancing transmutation effects to drain a target's strength and temporarily transfer it to the wielder. While a bit more ostentatious, the golden helms of Xin-Shalast were equally practical, allowing their wearer to temporarily turn their body into living metal, while maintaining the appearance of a golden statue. And that emphasis on pragmatism segues into the fourth and final defining feature of Karzoug's rule, his unending war with his neighbor Alaznist, the Runelord of Wrath. Alaznist had risen to the status of Runelord just 20 years before Karzoug, and the two of them were each the strongest and most successful Runelords of their respective sins. Her nation of Bakrakhan bordered Shalast along a long raised ridge called the Rasp, which ran north to south for hundreds of miles. The exact date at which the two nations came to blows is unknown, but in -5720 AR, Alaznist began construction of several security measures along the border, which she dubbed Hellstorm Flumes. Karzoug responded with defensive constructions of his own, a series of enormous statues of himself into which he could project his mind directly to observe his borders. These he dubbed the Sentinel Statues. Karzoug also maintained a forward observation post near modern-day Magnamar at the southern end of the Eyerspan. This location was equipped with a powerful divination tool called the Arcanum Optica, which allowed the officers and mages stationed at the site to project a living map of the border region onto their observation table for the purposes of both reconnaissance and planning. This site, and the southern end of the Eyerspan in general, served as a sort of neutral ground between the two nations, even at the height of the war, and diplomats from both kingdoms were often stationed nearby to negotiate temporary truces, or ceasefires. The war between Karzoug and Alaznist lasted for 400 years, flaring to life every few decades as armies were raised and unleashed, only to be smashed together and destroyed, with little territorial gain on either side. Between these flare-ups, the war would go cold. In this phase, the conflict between the archwizards was more personal and direct. Assassination attempts, attempted theft of academic research, and campaigns of propaganda and politics. Only the eventual arrival of Earthfall could bring it to an end. But that's still a few centuries away. We'll get there. At some point during the war, Alaznist succeeded in stealing the Sihedron Shard of Greed, which Karzoug had inherited from his predecessors. As a brief reminder, this was the shard of Zin's powerful Sihedron artifact, which was infused with transmutation magic. How Alaznist stole the shard is unclear, but Karzoug was quick to respond. Rather than steal his own shard back, the Runelord of Greed set his sights on another, the Shard of Gluttony, controlled by Runelord Zutha in Gastache. Karzoug succeeded in stealing the Shard of Gluttony, then sought out a place beneath Kaer Maga where the shard might never be found. Unwilling to trust the Kullborn who ruled the City of Strangers, Karzoug instead made his way into the depths of their cavernous realm until he came across the Dark Forest, a pocket dimension ruled by a mysterious Dullahan called the Dark Rider. Karzoug entrusted the Shard of Gluttony to the Rider, in conjunction with one of his allies from far-off Eox, trusting them to keep it hidden from the agents Zutha would inevitably send to recover it. The unending war between Karzoug and Alaznist was so damaging that the citizens of both Shalast and Bakrakhan feared that the conflict might soon spin out of control and unintentionally trigger the end of the world. As the centuries wore on, however, it became increasingly clear that Alaznist had the edge, and had it not been for the coming of Earthfall, she might have finally proved victorious. More on that tomorrow. So these were the four defining features of Karzoug's rule: his merciless cruelty, his love of massive construction projects, his unending thirst for understanding, and his eternal war with Alaznist, his most hated rival. But how did Karzoug govern? Who did he count as allies, and what servants did he rely upon? Karzoug had a great many allies during his reign, due in no small part to his vast wealth. He commanded the loyalty of a large number of dragons, ranging from hatchlings watched by his rune giants to elder dragons and even one or two great wyrms. Pre-remaster, most of these were blue dragons, though post-remaster it seems likely that the fortune dragons would have held the strongest affinity for the philosophy of greed. He also held some power over the Scarlet Walkers, a giant species of arachnid with ties to the nightmare realm of Leng. His most fervent servants, however, were the Lamias. Lamia Harridans represented his most loyal and trusted lieutenants, while Lamia matriarchs served as the commanders of field operations, or as spies and assassins. Karzoug also experimented in the art of flesh warping on the Lamias, resulting in the creation of the Lamia Hungerer, a deformed and mutated subspecies who experienced unending pain and torment. Disturbingly, these bloated creatures believed they had been specially chosen and blessed by Karzoug, and served him loyally despite their suffering. Like the other rune lords, Karzoug also commanded the loyalty of a large number of rune giants, which I discussed in depth 2 days ago. Additionally, Karzoug held substantial power over the churches in his domain. Most prominent among them were the Church of Zin-Shalast, which I discussed earlier, the Church of Lasala, and the Church of Lamashtu. Lamashtu's faith grew in prominence in Shalast because of Karzoug's history with demon binding, and the importance he placed upon the art. As such, priestesses of Lamashtu had the opportunity to rise to prominence in his kingdom. Karzoug also had many apprentices, much like Haframa and the other Runelords of Greed before him. His most powerful apprentice was a human wizard named Khalib. Khalib was a powerful transmuter in his own right, and had eyes on Karzoug's throne. Many other apprentices filled Karzoug's court as well, though little to no detail has been provided on these individuals or their social hierarchy. In his conflicts with his fellow runelords, Karzoug was well known for his guile and his willingness to employ creative solutions in the face of military, magical, or logistical issues. One example is his exceptional use of the Rest Resources ritual. This powerful ritual allowed the caster to instantly transpose material resources from one location to another. This was an expensive procedure, however, and required material components of substantial value. As such, it presented a great risk. The ritual was originally designed to aid in mining and resource extraction, and if the cost of the material components for the ritual exceeded the value of the resources gathered, then the whole venture would be a net loss. Conventional wisdom among the Runelords of Greed was to only use this ritual in resource-rich regions, where the resources collected were highly likely to cover the cost of the spell. Karzoug, though, realized the ritual's true potential, not as a resource extraction tool, but as a means of theft. Karzoug used his surveillance and spycraft to gain knowledge of the treasure vaults and storage facilities of his rivals. Then he would cast the ritual to transport their most valuable resources to his kingdom. While he occasionally used this to steal gold or gems, he more often used it to destroy an enemy's food reserves, exacerbating famines and logistical issues for his rivals whenever they were most vulnerable. As Karzoug's rule wore on, his war with Alaznist continued to escalate. Each archwizard sought an edge over the other, and in -5620 AR, Karzoug thought he had found one. With the expertise of his allies from Leng, he set to work on yet another massive construction project. This project took the form of a towering stone ring over 700 feet in diameter. The stones were carved with runes of power and infused with divination magic, and the entire ring was oriented vertically, allowing a witness to stand on the ground to face south and peer through the ring. This was the Cipher Gate, a device intended to allow Karzoug to peer into the dimension of time, and thus divine the future. While construction of the device was completed rather quickly, Karzoug never succeeded in putting it to use. Over the remaining centuries of his rule, he spent substantial time developing and refining the Fulcrum Key ritual required to activate the Cipher Gate, a task which he never quite managed to complete. This doesn't appear to have been a sore spot for Karzoug, however, so this might be an indicator of his patience and willingness to plan for the long term. Had he succeeded in activating this device during his mortal life, it's possible the act might have raised him to mythic status. The Cipher Gate was originally constructed in the air as a free-floating ring of stone, but after it was completed, it was lowered into the ground, magically phasing into the bedrock so the center of the ring was more or less at ground level. For those unfamiliar with Varisian geography, the Cipher Gate can still be seen over the city of Riddleport to this day, partially submerged beneath the waves and buried in the silt of the sea floor. Another of Karzoug's projects, later in his rule, was an effort he shared with several of his fellow Runelords. Many of the ancient wizard kings of Thassilon were justifiably afraid of massive calamities which might impact their kingdoms. Some of this fear was due to the escalating tensions between the Runelords themselves, while the rest of it was likely driven by memories of the Oliphant of Jondelay and the invasion by Aslant. Most of the Runelords chose to pursue some means of suspended animation, which they might employ to avoid a cataclysm entirely, then exit to return to power once the danger had passed. Karzoug's method of choice was a powerful artifact called a Rune Well, a device which Runelord Sorshan had developed early in her rule. I'll discuss the Rune Wells in detail in Sorshan's video near the end of this series, but for now, just know that it was a device which could create demiplanes outside of time. The Rune Well could then absorb energy from the souls of sinners to reopen the demiplane and allow those within to wake from their slumber and return to the material plane. This Rune Well would prove incredibly important in the 5th century of Karzoug's rule. As the Earthfall calamity drew closer, the Cullborn of Kaer Maga, oh yeah, they're still around by the way, foresaw the apocalyptic threat. While the Cullborn had provided their visions to the Runelords of Greed for practically a millennium at this point, they chose to keep this particular vision, one which was more clear and terrible than any they had experienced before, to themselves. Rather than report to Karzoug, the Cullborn retreated to the depths of their hidden cave networks beneath Kaer Maga. Karzoug, of course, took notice of the sudden disappearance of such valuable and powerful advisors, and set to work devising a workaround for his sudden blindness to future events. While he continued to toil away at the activation ritual for the Cipher Gate, he also took more immediate and extreme measures, for fear of whatever had driven the Cullborn into hiding. Karzoug put out a call for powerful priests of each of the dozen gods actively worshipped in Shalast. Imprisoning these clerics, Karzoug and his researchers transported them to the waterlogged caverns beneath Kaer Maga. There, the true work began. The 12 clerics were blinded, and their consciousnesses were bound together and interwoven via magic. Their bodies were rendered mostly comatose and left to float in the shallow waters at the cavern's floor. Their minds, by contrast, were left partially intact, though they no longer existed as distinct individuals. Instead, the 12 clerics now existed as a strange hive mind, a single entity which took up the title of the God Pool. The God Pool reached out to its 12 patron deities, begging at the behest of its master Karzoug for a vision of the future. And, though they might have been disgusted at the fate of their clerics, the gods of ancient Aslant could not turn a blind eye to the begging of their captured servants. They provided a vision, a glimpse of the impending devastation of Earthfall. Karzoug had what he needed. Now consumed by a need to survive the impending calamity, Karzoug abandoned the God Pool beneath Kaer Maga and returned to Zin Shalast to consolidate his power. Working with his mightiest apprentice Kalib and his rune giants, Karzoug first devised the plan for his immediate survival. He would enter the Eye of Avarice, the demiplane created by his Rune Well of Greed. There, he would enter a form of temporal stasis. Back on the material plane, Kalib and 35 rune giants would enter a similar form of stasis. This material plane stasis would end after 100 years, at which point Kalib, or the giants, would gather sinful souls to fill the Rune Well and open a portal to the Eye of Avarice, thus freeing Karzoug. To harvest these sinful souls, Karzoug developed a pair of artifacts. the anima focus, and the soul lens. The anima focus, which was used by more than one rune lord in conjunction with their rune wells, maintained a connection between the material plane and the Eye of Avarice. This connection could be activated using sin energy. The source of this sin energy was the soul lens, which harvested it directly from sinful souls. To get these souls, people who indulged in greed would be marked with the Sihedron rune as part of a ritual. Upon their deaths, their souls would pass through the soul lens on their way to the afterlife, at which point the lens would act as a filter, pulling out the essence of greed and allowing the soul to pass on to Pharasma unscathed. Well, mostly unscathed. Of course, this was only one part of the plan. Many of Karzoug's loyal followers were expected to ride out the disaster in secure locations on the material plane. These included the Skulls Crossing Dam, the Giltspur facility, Kaer Maga, and the many fortresses throughout Shalast. Karzoug and his fellow rune lords expected the damage on the material plane to be akin to that suffered during a large earthquake or volcanic eruption. They expected that their servants on the material plane might suffer, but would ultimately survive. Still, Karzoug saw fit to prepare one last contingency plan. He contacted his allies at Giltspur and tasked them with devising a means of ensuring his military dominance upon his eventual return. The denizens of Leng turned their considerable intellect to the problem, and eventually produced an artifact simply dubbed the Leng device. This machine was intended to reach back through time and create a portal through which Karzoug could march his armies as they existed on the eve of Earthfall. The Leng device was set up in Karzoug's palace and was prepared for his eventual return to Golarion. And, on the eve of Earthfall, with the Starstone meteor hurtling toward Golarion's surface, Karzoug entered the Eye of Avarice, confident in his preparations. This confidence, as it turned out, was misplaced. For players interested in playing characters who pursue either the sin of greed or the virtue of generosity, or who otherwise focus on transmutation, here are a few useful details. Common personal edicts associated with the sin of greed might include to acquire material wealth regardless of the needs of others, to engage in displays of wealth and power, or to use transmutation effects to turn mundane materials into those which are valuable or visually pleasing. Conversely, personal edicts associated with the virtue of generosity might include to use personal resources to benefit others, to use transformative magic to pragmatic ends rather than extravagant ones, or to efficiently and sustainably gather resources so they might be distributed to those in need. Obviously, if you're using the alignment system, characters engaging in greedy behavior will tend toward evil alignments, while characters engaging in generous behavior will tend toward good. Characters who wield weapons in combat might gravitate toward the glaive, in reference to Transmutation's Alara Keen, or the scimitar, in reference to the associated Alara High. These weapons are relatively common in the Inner Sea region for a number of reasons, including that each of them is associated with major religious figures in the region, most prominently Shelyn and Sarenrae. The shifting property rune might be another fantastic way to incorporate transmutation into a martial character's fighting style. Similarly, combination weapons might serve as a symbolic connection to transmutation, as they transform between their melee and ranged modes. Visually, characters associated with the runic school of transmutation might dress themselves in the color yellow, as that color was associated with the school of transmutation in Thassilonian culture. Outside of the strictest practices of rune magic, indigo was also taken as a representative of transmutation as well, though most often as a secondary color. Characters who follow the teachings of greed will often decorate themselves in opulent jewelry, often made from gold and colored gems. Runelord Karzoug was even known to have implanted gemstones into his skin, some of which were magical and some of which were entirely aesthetic. Conversely, those who follow the teachings of charity are more likely to dress in simple, humble garb. This wouldn't preclude them from using pragmatic or even expensive adventuring gear, of course, only from needlessly spending money on gear which is purely decorative. In addition to this, Thassilonian aesthetic sensibilities included the use of runic tattoos on one's body, or runic engravings on one's gear. Obviously, from a class perspective, a wizard focused on transformation spells, ranging from support spells like Feet to Fins to combat spells like Dragon Form, would be the ultimate representation of the classical runic school of transmutation. That said, wizards are hardly the only class who can effectively wield transmutation magic. Any caster might employ polymorph or morph spells. Druids of the Untamed Order have a particularly strong connection to transmutation magic, as the Untamed Form feats allow druids to lean very hard into polymorph battle form spells. Connecting to my proposal from a few videos ago about opening up the title of Runelord to non-wizard classes, I actually think an Untamed Druid might be the best choice for an off-the-wall pick for a Runelord of Transmutation. Witches, or other characters with familiars, might take familiar abilities which create physical transformations to connect to the themes of transmutation. These might include the Gills, Master's Form, Plant Form, and the Tattoo Transformation abilities. As for familiar choices, animals which undergo dramatic physical transformations during their natural life cycles, like butterflies or frogs, might be an excellent choice of symbolic transmutation. Non-spellcasting classes with a connection to transmutation might include the Alchemist, in part due to alchemy's connection to the transmutation of lead into gold. Alchemists might express an interest in transmutation with either mutagens or various alchemical concoctions. Other classes and archetypes which induce physical transformations, such as the animal or dragon instinct barbarian, the lycanthrope from Howl of the Wild, or the Ursine Hood from Treasure Vault, might all allow martial characters to engage with transmutation effects despite being non-spellcasters. For similar reasons, ancestries and heritages with transformation abilities, such as the Anadi or Beastkin, might also consider themselves infused with transmutation magic. From a religious perspective, several deities might appeal to characters interested in the runic school of transmutation. Abadar, as the god of commerce, would appeal to followers of either greed or generosity. Nivirambadazzle, as a goddess of gemstones, might be appealing as well, though her tendency towards good over evil might prevent her from holding too much appeal to practitioners of greed magic. Practitioners of generosity might find some appeal in Falena, Laudinmio, or Kofusachi. By contrast, practitioners of greed might be drawn to Mammon, the treasure keeper of hell. The prophecies of Calistrade, as popularized in Druma, might also draw some characters associated with the runic school of transmutation. The conventional teachings of the prophecies will likely appeal most strongly to practitioners of greed, while offshoot sects, like the now-defunct Golden Solidarity, might appeal more strongly to practitioners of generosity. Due to Shalast's association with Leng, several elder gods might have some appeal as well, most prominently Nyarlathotep. And of course, any gods of magic or knowledge might appeal to anyone seeking to explore the lost arts of rune magic. These might include, but are certainly not limited to, Nethys, Irori, Gruhashta, Magd, Yulral, Ing, and Abraxas. Finally, a few other cultural touchstones on Golarion tie into transmutation magic. In Varisian cultural tradition, the hero cards the Wanderer and the Twin are tied to transmutation magic. Astrologically, the planet Abalon, the Mercury to Golarion's Earth, is seen as a cosmic representative of transmutation. For GMs looking to incorporate the Runelords of Greed, the runic school of transmutation, or the remnants of the nation of Shalast into an adventure or campaign, here are a few more ideas. As I discussed earlier, 3 Runelords, Masmirana, Aethusa, and Fethrir, are functionally black boxes in terms of lore. We know almost nothing about them, aside from their years of rule and a few major events from their times in power. This allows a GM a huge amount of narrative flexibility related to the School of Greed. Any number of homebrew plot hooks, from newly discovered ruins or monuments to powerful transmutation spells and rituals to newly found caches of lost arcane knowledge, might all be written such that they tie back to any of these runelords, with little risk of contradicting the established lore. Getting a bit more specific, a plotline directly connected to the history of transmutation and the Runelords of Greed might involve the restoration of the Golden Woman Chelyn, original wielder of the Sword of Greed. The fate of Chelyn's body after it reverted to a statue is unknown, to the best of my knowledge. It was presumably lost during the Earthfall calamity, so it's entirely possible that it managed to survive to the present day. An experimental transmuter in New Thassilon might stumble upon the statue at any time, and devise its nature as the once living woman of gold. This transmuter might then reverse engineer a way to restore Chelyn's body to life. To recombine her mind and body, this transmuter will need to acquire the Sword of Greed, then reunite her body and consciousness. While this might restore a tremendously powerful and evil threat to the world in Chelyn herself, it might also have the effect of removing the evil consciousness from the Sword of Greed, allowing it to be used as a tool for good. Chelyn might also become loyal to the new Runelord of Greed, or generosity, should one rise to power in the Age of Lost Omens. While the Runelords were historically tied to sin, the rise of New Thassilon has seen the study of rune magic decoupled from indulgence in sin as a requisite activity. A benevolent Runelord of generosity might be able to change Chelyn's perspective on the world and make her a force for good in the universe. Finally, the God Pool, the living prophecy engine which Karzoug developed to glimpse the oncoming devastation of Earthfall, still exists beneath Kermaga. The bodies of the 12 clerics are still alive, floating in the cold, dark waters where they were left. Even in the Age of Lost Omens, their collective mind might still be used to peer into the future, though the authenticity of these prophecies has certainly fallen into question since the death of Eredin. Beyond seeking the God Pool out for its prophetic abilities, PCs might be tasked with destroying the abomination. Most of the gods whose clerics were sacrificed and consumed by the God Pool see the device as a horrid abomination, and would certainly take comfort in seeing it destroyed. Of course, the God Pool itself is still alive, and will fight back, and the combined powers of the 12 clerics have rendered the collective mind into an incredibly powerful divine spellcaster. One source in 1e explains that the God Pool will fight back if confronted, and is capable of casting spells as a 20th level cleric. It also has access to all the domain spells in the GM core, making it incredibly versatile. And that marks the end of Day 5 of the 12 Days of Sinmas, and my examination of the Sin of Greed. This section of the series was particularly interesting to write, mostly because of the prominence of Karzoug in the lore of the Age of Lost Omens. His history is incredibly important to the rise of the Runelord's adventure path, and many gaming groups here in the real world have a strong connection to his schemes and machinations. Speaking from personal experience, Rise was the second campaign my wife and I ever played as a duet, so Karzoug and the Runelords are incredibly close to our hearts. The prominence of this AP in Paizo's history is also why this video came out so long. The other Sin-specific videos in this series won't be quite this long, since the information available about the other Runelords and their nations is less detailed. Well, with one exception. Over the next 7 videos in this series, I'll continue my discussion of the Runelords and their nations, going sin by sin through Thassilonian history. Up next is the Sin of Wrath, the most explosive and directly dangerous of the 7, and the chosen sin of Karzoug's greatest rival, Runelord Alaznist. Also, fair warning, this is another 2-parter. I didn't think we had enough information on Alaznist, then I reread Return of the Runelords. Yikes. See you tomorrow.